Right. Well, thanks everyone. We're going to get started here now. So good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Marla McLeod and I'm the Director of Programs here at the Ecology Action Center. And I'd like to thank you all for tuning into this panel discussion, The Future of Green Energy and Utility Regulation in Mi'kma'ki. Tonight, we're gathered in the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, which is governed by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship. These treaties were signed in the 1700s by the British and were later affirmed in Section 35 of Canada's Constitution in 1982. These treaties do not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but rather set out a framework for how the relationship between Mi'kmaq and settlers should unfold in peace and in friendship. For me, speaking a land acknowledgement is an invitation to reflect on the violence and injustices inherent in our racist colonial systems that we all still live with, and which profoundly impact the lives of Indigenous and Black people in Canada. For tonight's discussion, that feels very relevant. What we're talking about, how our power utility can serve us instead of the other way around, is clearly a systemic issue. It is an example of how the structures and systems we create can perpetuate injustice and fail to serve citizens and the environment. It is fantastic to see so many folks here tonight, especially since the discussion of how power utility is regulated might run the risk of being obscure, overwhelming, or dangerously full of acronyms. But I think we're actually all here tonight because we know this topic is profoundly and tangibly relevant to our daily lives, to issues of energy poverty, community justice, the environment, and our collective future. So let's dig in and talk about how we can go about changing those systems so they serve us and not corporate greed. This year, the EAC turned 50 years old, and we're pleased to continue hosting forums such as the one tonight to connect our communities, inspire action, and address some of the most important environmental issues of Mi'kma'ki. Tonight is sure to be just one stage in what will surely be a longer conversation on our electricity system. We are recording tonight's presentation. Immediately afterward, it will be available on Facebook and tomorrow on our website and YouTube channel. We'd encourage you to share the recording and as well to sign up to get information on next steps. So we'll be sharing the link a few times through this evening. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for tonight, Jessie Hitchcock. Jessie is a sustainability and policy expert with cross-sectoral experience in environmental science and the energy transition. She has worked in the public service, academia, not-for-profit, and private sectors, focusing on energy efficiency programs and policies, transportation electrification, and energy equity. And we are very pleased to have her join us to moderate this panel tonight.
Thanks, Marla, and welcome everyone. We're really excited to have you with us tonight. I was personally really excited when the EAC reached out to me to moderate because a lot of my recent work, has been focusing on how the utility regulatory environment can actually help us achieve some of these lofty societal and climate goals. I know, as Marla mentioned, that this can seem like a dry topic, but I really do think it has the potential to be transformative for the energy industry. So thank you again for joining us for this really important discussion. I have a couple of housekeeping items. We have some folks joining us on Zoom, and then we also have people on the Facebook live stream. So we do have a tech team working behind the scenes. You can reach out through either the Zoom chat or just in the comments on the Facebook live stream if you have any issues with the feeds. We're going to start with 4 questions for our panelists, and then we will be taking questions from the floor. So definitely drop those questions into, again, the Q&A box on the Zoom. Or in the comment section of the Facebook stream. And you can do that throughout as the questions come to you. You don't need to wait to the end. And then we'll have folks behind the scenes, again, going through those questions, and we'll give them to the panelists at the Q&A session. Now for the exciting part, I'm going to introduce our panelists. So tonight we're joined by Tina Northup from East Coast Environmental Law. We have Brendan Haley from Efficiency Canada. We have Gurprasad Gurumurthy from the Ecology Action Center. And we have Tom Webb and Tynette Deveaux, who are from Sierra Club, and they're going to be splitting their time tonight. These panelists are all very impressive and exciting people, and they have diverse experience in the energy sector. So I really encourage you to go read their bios. They're on the event page for this event, and you can get a deeper sense of their backgrounds and their expertise. We're very, very fortunate to have them all here with us tonight. So thanks, everybody. I'm reminded that our time here tonight is short, so I'm going to move right into the first question. One of the reasons that the EAC wanted to bring people together tonight to host this discussion is, of course, the recent proposal from Nova Scotia Power. As I think probably everybody on the line knows, this proposal included a new system access charge for customers to generate their own electricity through solar, as well as a general rate increase. And there was a lot of buzz from the industry and other stakeholders pretty much instantaneously when this came out. I know I was quite shocked myself, so I'm really interested to hear from each of our panelists. What was your initial reaction to the proposal and kind of what was going through your mind when you first heard it? And we'll start with Tynette for this question.
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, so first reaction, they packed such a big punch into their announcement. It was the first thing that I became aware of actually was that they were going to delay the retirement of one of their coal fire plants, Trenton 5, by another year. And it just sort of underscores how the corporation has been dragging its heels. But I think one of the things that really struck me when I first saw the announcement, in addition to the further delay of retiring coal, was the wording that Peter Gregg used in the announcement, which was saying that, you know, we understand that people would like to transition off of coal and fossil fuels quickly, and therefore, you know, we'll do our best, but you're going to have to pay for it. And I just thought it was, you know, a little bit surprising that got by their PR people. And I was really glad to see that people pushed back. I thought it was, you know, I think Nova Scotia Power this time pulled the curtain back on itself and sort of was a sitting duck after that.
Yeah, you make a great point about just how many things were in the proposal as well. It was sort of like a lot coming all at once. Mm-hmm. Brendan, what about you? What was going through your mind when you heard?
Well, I was surprised because it came at a time when there's no upgraded long-term plan that would have taken into account, you know, higher carbon pricing than previously planned, which would enhance the value of things like solar and energy efficiency. But on the other hand, I don't think this should be surprising at all. The previous government capped electricity rates, and they did that to avoid responsibility and political blame in their term of government. And so I don't think it's surprising that there's some non-fuel costs that have, you know, built up because of that decision. And the solar proposal itself is not necessarily surprising. Because net metered solar looks like energy efficiency to the utility. It decreases the revenues they get from sales. And you know, the way the utility is regulated in Nova Scotia, that makes NSP particularly adverse to seeing those decreased sales. And that's because we lock in a rate. Afterwards, the utility can earn more revenue by increasing the sales at that fixed price. In Nova Scotia, it's even worse. There's something called the fuel adjustment mechanism. Any increases in fuel costs are kind of automatically recouped, but other investments that can reduce fossil fuel use would have to go through a new rate case. So we're at a stage where I think the province has defined this net zero future for itself, and it's had significant policy success with community-based forms of energy, but the utility is not regulated in a way that aligns with those policy goals right now.
That's a great point too about the like longer term history and context that gets us to this point. And we know governments move slow, but utilities certainly move slow as well. So it's a lot happening. Guru, what you guys were on this very quickly. What were your kind of initial reactions?
Yeah, I second Brendan and Tynette that I wasn't surprised. Something like that was expected now or sometime later in a different context, of course. But as soon as I saw the news, I knew that it was going to be urgent. It's going to be something in which people are going to speak up. And I was thankful to see that people spoke up immediately. And that motivated me to speak up as well. And talk to the press immediately on this issue.
Yeah, it was so great. I loved seeing how quickly. I thought it was going to be one of those, nerdy Twitter things, but everybody seemed to really just get excited about it. Tina, what about you?
Sure. Well, I'll say honestly that my immediate reaction, the news broke at a time when I was deep in the weeds of another matter, preparing a submission on part of the environmental assessment for Northern Pulp's proposed new mill facilities. And so my immediate reaction was to recognize, well, this is going to be a big deal, and we're going to be getting some questions about this, but I have kind of no time to think about this right now. So I kind of mentally bookmarked it and plan to circle back to it later. And then what I found so interesting was that by the time I was able to come back to it a few days later, I mean, the situation on the ground had really evolved so rapidly. It was such an immediate response from industry, from ENGOs, from members of the public, and then from government as well. We saw really interesting, kind of initial responses voicing concern. And then, not very long before, there was a government announcement that more decisive action would be taken. So for me, I think it was a bit of a different thing, where by the time I came to it with some headspace to look at it, a lot of the initial dust had already settled, and we were looking at a little bit of a different landscape in terms of thinking about what needed to be done going forward. So what struck me coming at it from that more delayed moment was that ultimately, aside from everything else that happened, I do think that the proposals created a really opportune moment for a province-wide discussion. And I think we've seen that happening. And I think it's really great, honestly. I mean, everything else aside, I think the conversation that has been opened up is much needed. And I hope it continues, and I hope it leads to good change.
Yeah, I so agree with you that it does feel like a bit of a moment is happening with this discussion. I think even though it might not be surprising in terms of for the folks on this panel, I do think a lot of Nova Scotians were surprised that Nova Scotia Power was allowed to put this proposal forward, because it does seem counterintuitive to recent government commitments to 80% renewables by 2030. And I think, that there's a bit of a disconnect. How can my utility do this when my government is saying this other thing? So I think anytime we have these types of ambitious goals and targets, there's always a lot of players involved. Like Tina, you just mentioned several of them: government, regulators, utilities, industry stakeholders. So I'm going to move to the next question, which is just, what do you think for each panelist is the biggest barrier to really advancing these targets and achieving these goals in Nova Scotia? And Brendan, I'll start with you.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the biggest threat to that technical goal, which is in law now and policy, it's politics. It's political. I don't really think Nova Scotia needs a new political bargain that defines how are we going to provide these needs for energy affordability, for accountability in the next 10 to 20 years that we have for the net zero transition. And I say that because I think this rate case is a fork in the road, I think, for the energy transition. And it's all about the politics around electricity rates. And there's a long history with that. I mean, when I worked for the EAC, politicians still remembered when a government was defeated in 1978 over electricity rates. In 2013, the neoliberals won on a platform really exploiting anger over electricity rates. And that resulted in the cap of Efficiency Nova Scotia's budget, cancellation of community renewables projects, some capping then of net metering projects. So there's a choice, right? The province can, I think, continue with this, politics of pushing off rate increases for someone else to deal with, or they can find a way to promote affordability that's in keeping with decentralized energy technologies, helping people take control over their energy use. And you can do that, I think, not by focusing so much on the price you see, but on the bill that actually impacts your pocketbook. And that bill can be reduced, and GHGs can be reduced with energy efficiency, on-site renewables like solar, compensation for people who change their timing of their energy use. And if we can find kind of a new politics that matches up with those technologies, I think we can hit that target.
Yeah, those are really great points about how the short-term victory, like we're often thinking about, or politicians are campaigning on the price of electricity. We're going to lower it or we're going to keep it the same, but actually what we should be focusing on is how do we get the bills lower, and how do we help people at the end of the day? Guru, what about you? What do you think is the biggest barrier to achieving the target?
Great summary, Brendan. I too believe that the barriers that we're talking about are not technological. If you want to find out technology pathways, reports exist and people have spoken on ways to get to these renewable energy targets. It's not economic, so like very clearly, it's something which is, I would say I put it as lack of action on climate, and it's a big problem. And the second bigger problem is lack of cooperation. Right now, we need a utility that works for the people, works with the government on, getting affordable energy to people, reaching these renewable energy targets, taking them seriously, because we are at a decade which is going to change the way 2040s or 2050s will look like in terms of climate change. And we're right now, if without this coordination, it's going to be super hard to achieve these climate goals.
Those are really great points. Tina, I'm going to go to you next.
Sure. I think I maybe come at this a little bit differently, because my sense is that, I agree that the barriers to achieving the goals are at this point maybe largely political. And for that reason, I honestly don't see really a lot of significant barriers that I think, this is really in our way. Personally, the technology is there, and I think that there's actually considerable will there, not just from government, but also from industry. But I think what is the more important question is not, whether or not we can reach that target of 80% renewable electricity, but how are we going to get there? What does this mix of renewable electricity look like? And also, is the path going to be a path that's based fundamentally on principles of equity and social justice? And those, to me, are the pieces that are lacking right now. Nova Scotia's definition of renewable electricity for the purposes of this target includes at least one source that is an intensive GHG emitting source. That's not helping us face the climate emergency to be thinking about incorporating that kind of quote unquote renewable source in our energy mix into the future. And then more generally, these questions about, whether we're going to be able to meet the current moment in an equitable way, in a just way, in a way that is affordable, that is going to protect low income and moderate income Nova Scotians from rates they can't afford. Those aren't just questions about meeting the target, they're questions about how we get there. And I do think the Utility and Review Board has a really important role to play in helping us get there. But right now it has not been well equipped to do the kinds of analyses and to ask the kinds of questions and demand the kinds of answers that we need to get there in a good way. So, and I will be speaking more about that as we go forward. But
yeah, I totally agree with you. I think it's tough when there is this kind of adversarial relationship between how people see the utility and them also needing to play a fundamental role in where we go from here. So hopefully conversations like this can help with that. Tynette, last but not least.
I agree that we have a political problem, but I think it goes deeper than that. We have a situation where corporations are driven by profit. So that's what a corporation knows. That's what Emera knows. The CEO, the last published income statement that we have is $8 million for 2020, So I don't think it's in Emera's interest to assist Nova Scotia with its climate reduction or GHG reduction goals. And in fact, 2 weeks before this announcement, Sierra Club had a meeting with the CEO of Nova Scotia Power, and we were told that their plan to get off coal is to build a natural gas plant, which we would call a frack gas plant, in the next 2 years, and also transition a few of its coal units to fracked gas. So it's like we're not even really on the same planet, you know? And I think we have to accept that, you know, the needs of shareholders and the CEOs to bring in the highest profit fundamentally is at odds with the needs of Nova Scotians and our climate.
That's a really great segue into the next question. I know this is a challenge in terms of the utilities, you know, the way that they're regulated and the way that they make their profits is not aligned with what we want them to be doing, which is advancing these kind of larger societal goals that we all share. So we saw, as Tina mentioned earlier, that the provincial government announced that they will introduce new legislation as a response to Nova Scotia Power's proposal. And I think we all eagerly await what that will look like. But what opportunity do you folks think this provides? And what are some examples of what you might like to see included in that legislation? And Tina, I'm going to start with you for this one.
Thanks. So, I mean, the short answer is that, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what this opportunity will provide, because at this point, it's not really clear what exactly the legislation might set out to do. It could take a fairly narrow approach. It could take a much broader approach. And I mean, to just give just one quick example that might be of interest, back in the spring of 2021, the government at that time introduced legislation that was designed to take some control over the net metering program out of the hands of Nova Scotia Power and put it into the hands of the government and regulations. The idea was that regulations could be made that would set out sort of the specifics of the net metering program. The regulations would have been made by the cabinet. And one of the effects of that, as I understand that legislation, would have been that considerable power would have been taken out of the hands of the Utility and Review Board as well, as a regulatory overseer and as you know, as the tribunal equipped to like really dig into whatever numbers and plans are being set. Like that to me is not the sort of thing that I would want to see going forward. If anything like that might be on the table now, I really do think it's important to utilize the expertise of the Utility and Review Board. One of the values of having a body like that is that over time it builds up considerable experience and expertise that I think is valuable and I think we can draw on. So what I see as being really important, if at all possible right now, and if the government is, you know, listening and willing to entertain these ideas, I think the Utility and Review Board needs its mandate updated. I think that mandate needs to needs to give the Utility and Review Board clear direction to regulate in keeping with principles of sustainability, equity, and social justice. And I also think the other big thing that needs to change is that when the UARB, and sorry, that's short for Utility and Review Board, when the board is conducting cost benefit analyses and trying to weigh out what is fair for ratepayers, what are the costs of maintaining a safe and reliable grid, what are the costs that ratepayers can be reasonably said to need to pay, that those costs and benefits accurately take into account all the real costs and benefits. So taking into account things like the social cost of carbon, of continuing to emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, taking into account the benefits of avoiding additional greenhouse gas emissions. All of these things ought to weigh into the equation, but they don't at this time. And the utility is in some ways, or the regulator is in some ways hamstrung when it comes to those kinds of things. So I think those kinds of changes would help it to regulate in a better way.
Could not agree with you more on those points, Tina. I think the way that we do cost effectiveness testing now is really for a different time. And I think we'll probably talk more about that. Guru, what about you?
I'll add on to Tina's point. I agree that there needs to be a lens of sustainability within the Utilities and Review Board and to regulate Nova Scotia Power in the way that it functions for the people. But I also want to add that we can look towards, use this opportunity. We have been trying to get to this conversation for a while now, And since we are here now and the momentum is there, let's go and revisit what our electricity system looks like. We have a utility which is vertically integrated, and it's a corporate entity. It's private. Can we make it work for the people in the way that a performance-based regulation can govern the utility? What it means is that to meet certain standards of service, the utility needs to meet certain set of standards. Right now we have generation-based performance, but we want to see reliable supply-based performance, that we don't face power cuts for a long period of time. We have, people are ensured that you'll get the service that you're paying for. That kind of performance-based regulations. Can we work on that? And can we look into the solar policy? For instance, people have been calling for raising the net metering cap from 100 kilowatts to 1 megawatt. Can we do that now? And also, when we're revisiting what it means to have renewables, can we remove biomass from the definition of renewables? Can we do that? These are the questions that come into my mind when I see regulatory challenges, regulatory changes that we can bring in. This is the moment, I would say. This is the moment, and it doesn't have to be coming from experts or analysts or the government. People can come up and say what they want to see. People can write to their representatives on what is important to them, and we are on time. We're right on time.
Yeah, I love those points. I think there's so many different pieces, and there can be this fear of like trying to do too many things, but regulatory reforms like this are interesting because they do provide an opportunity to kind of be bold and take advantage of this moment. Brendan, what do you think?
I think Guru's message is really inspiring. So yeah, I think the government has had this controversy with solar, which they're kind of trying to push, deal with. But the more interesting thing is the more fundamental structural problem, which is this misalignment of the incentives the utility has versus this net zero emission goal. And as we stated, the current NSP has a powerful disincentive to not welcome energy efficiency or customer solar on the grid. And as Guru said, there's systems of what's called decoupling and performance-based regulation that can deal with that. And what that's all about is first placing the emphasis on the total costs to operate the electricity system, and then seeking to basically minimize that entire bill that the province pays, to the utility, and then to take away any excess revenue from utilities if those sales are higher than anticipated. And so that removes that bad incentive essentially, right? But as Guru was mentioning, you want to then create good incentives, right? And we can reward the utility to do the things we actually want them to do. And on my list would be lower bills by people benefiting from energy efficiency, reliability, customer satisfaction, GHG reductions, which includes aggressive and smart electrification of transportation and heat, perhaps energy poverty reductions. So the government, I imagine, is kind of putting out the fire with the solar issue, but it can also think about the more fundamental misalignment that led to that decision.
I love this point, and I think what's interesting about performance-based regulation is it gives us, or it could give us, the opportunity to define those success metrics for ourselves. Like what works for Nova Scotia might not be what we need in another jurisdiction, and that's very exciting. And I think a lot of what Guru mentioned can be folded into that as well. Tom, we're going to go to you for this question. What are your thoughts on the new legislation?
Well, I think the first thing to remember in all of this is that the UARB does what the government tells it to do, and that's what it has always done. And so what we have is a failure of government to tell it what to do. And that's been pretty long-standing. So we need clear direction. The second thing we need is a reduced reasonable rate of return. The rate of return that's set now is just simply out of line. It goes back to another age and a different time in terms of financial reality. Then we need aggressive, hard targets for renewable energy. I like the comments that I've heard in terms of how to shape those and how to make them work. We also need programs and to help customers get off coal, oil, gas, biomass, and reduce wood. And you know, without those programs, the need for electricity simply will continue, and instead of being reduced. The programs, and especially as we turn to doing more and more things with electricity, we need to have programs that reduce electric energy use. So another thing is hard targets for outages. I don't think there are any targets for outages now. And the outages here are, you know, I live in Mahone Bay. We have a municipal utility and we have very few outages, but we did want to have one the other night of about 6 hours because the Nova Scotia Power link to Mahone Bay electric failed for 6 hours with the weather being basically pretty fine. So we really don't have the message that's going to the utility in terms of outages is not very strong. And finally, we need targets for the utility to deal with energy poverty. And it can either deal with it or have government deal with it in some other way. But the energy poverty just can't continue to be ignored.
I was mute. I almost talked on mute, but we're getting through the session without doing that. I think those are all really important points, Tom, and hopefully, yeah, we'll touch on them more, but I think we're all hopeful for government's legislation, and we'll see what's in it. We talked a little bit about this, but I think something that struck me when this was all happening was the public response. I think we all mentioned this. It was like almost immediate and it was quite robust. I think there was lots of folks out there supporting the solar industry. They were reaching out to decision makers, as Guru mentioned, sharing lots of thoughts about this issue. And I think what I worry about is that we know like government processes, let alone utility regulatory processes, are not always easy to engage with. In fact, they can be sort of the opposite. So for the last question, I think we're just looking for some advice that you all have as people who have been engaging in this space for a long time. What should citizens do now? What advice do you have for them to keep engaging on this issue and moving forward? And we're going to start with Tom again on this one. Oh, no, Tom, you're mute.
Off guard. I didn't expect.
We almost got there.
I didn't expect to go on that quickly.
Better you than me. Better you than me.
So very good. I think the most important regulator that I've ever seen work is something called democracy, and we need to realize that we don't live in a perfect democracy. We live in a quasi-democracy where many votes are not counted, and often the governments that are in power with a majority have 30 or 40% of the vote, often closer to 30 than 40. And so one of the things that I think we need to look at is there a different way to organize power utilities? Is there a different approach to it? And I want to use, and this isn't the only example, but I want to use the state of Nebraska as an example. In the state of Nebraska, there are no private sector utilities, not one. They have municipal utilities, electric cooperatives, and public power districts. Nebraska has 166 different community-owned utilities operating under one umbrella organization that they own and that they control. There are 647,000 people in Nebraska living in rural areas. So it's more rural than Nova Scotia. In Nebraska ranks third in the United States for the shortest outages in electricity. This works. This is a system that works, and it works better. Across the U.S., there are over 2,000 publicly owned or either cooperative or municipal utilities serving 43 million people. So these systems clearly work, and they work well. Can it really work? Well, Nebraska covers 76,000 square miles, almost 77,000, with more than 27,000 miles of power line. In Nova Scotia, we only have 55,000 square kilometers and only 21,000 square miles, 21,000 square miles, or about 28% the size of Nebraska. And Nova Scotia has 31,000 kilometers of power lines, or 19,000 miles. So in comparison, we're an easy, it's easy to make this work here. If it works in Nebraska, it will certainly work here. And then when we come to things like environmental sensitivity, the publicly owned and cooperative utilities are much more responsive. And in terms of rates, if you look at the utilities that surround Nebraska, it has the lowest rates of all of the utilities in its geographic climate area. So I think that what we need to realize is that it is possible to have an alternative model, that alternative models not only work, but they work better. And that if we regulate Nova Scotia Power and Emera to meet the needs of Nova Scotians, it is not going to be an attractive place for their shareholders to have their investments. It's just not. They won't get the kind of return. If you look at the amount of money that a private utility simply has to suck out of the economy of Nova Scotia, and you ask yourself, well, would you be better off spending that here on infrastructure or on renewables? The answer clearly has to be yes. And so I suspect that if you regulate Emera and Nova Scotia Power in the interest of Nova Scotia, they will cease to find this a very good place to be, and we need to have an alternative at hand.
Thanks, Tom. It's a good reminder, I think, for everybody to kind of think about how it works in other jurisdictions. I know, not everybody's just thinking about how different utilities are regulated in their spare time or in their all their waking hours. So I think it's a great reminder that this is happening in a different way and in lots of other places, and we can take lessons from that. Brendan, what about you? Advice for folks who want to continue engaging in this discussion as we move forward?
Well, it was great to see strong support for people, supporting a vision of taking control over their energy use. I absolutely agree with Tina that we need a good balance between sort of high-level direction on societal priorities from the government and that evidence-based process that you get at the utility board. So you can speak to your elected representatives, but support the EAC, who I assume is going to intervene, in the rate case and some others. I guess I'd like to say something kind of provocative, is that I agree with the CEO of Nova Scotia Power that we need to pay to reach climate goals. That is a fact. And, it's easy to get mad about rate increases. It's also easy for, advocates and politicians to exploit that anger and present a false promise that you don't have to pay for things like better reliability or GHG reductions. And I think that politics is dangerous and it puts the province in a dead end. So I really would encourage environmental advocates to, direct their energies towards the more difficult but totally achievable objective of defining the type of future we want the utility to support, building up those policies that facilitate trust and accountability so that we can invest in that future, right? Which needs to be one that's green and equitable.
Super important points. Guru, what's your advice? I know, like Brendan said, you guys are probably going to intervene. How can people keep up with this momentum?
Yeah, we do want to intervene in terms of talking more on energy efficiency. It is the cheapest way to get these decarbonization targets. It is the only way in some minds, in some minds of some experts, that to actually see net zero, if we want to call it net zero, at any time in the future. Having said that, I would also say that we are doing this, we are having this debate only when there was a strong voice that came together and people spoke up. So I would encourage folks listening in to ask questions, and I would encourage the government to listen in. It shouldn't have been this way. The government should have listened to all of this conversation beforehand. They should have known before NSP put out these proposals. They should have known that a general rate hike increase was in the order. And it's not just the rate hike, it's also a proposal to increase the return on investment. It's also a proposal to increase the equity percentage from 40 to 45%. So all of these things are something that people don't have the time or the energy or the mind to look into the nitty-gritties of it. It's government's task. So the government needs to listen in, and I'll encourage people to ask questions in whatever capacity they can.
Those are great points. I know Tynette wanted to comment on what Brendan said, so I'll let her do that, and then we'll go to Tina.
Yeah, I guess the part that doesn't sit so well with me in terms of acknowledging that it's going to cost more, or that we can agree with Nova Scotia Power that it's going to cost more. I'm not so sure that it's cheaper to build a frack gas plant than it is to ramp up wind and solar. Now, I admit I don't know anything about the technology, but I do read the reports that have come out that say that wind and solar are now the cheapest forms of energy, particularly wind. And I also think if it's going to cost more, then Emera needs to make less. I don't think the CEOs need to be getting $8 million a year. And I don't think they need a guaranteed rate of return that's way beyond what any of us would get if we were to invest our money. So I think we have a different set of needs. And I think the more we acknowledge that, the better. And I would add too that, winning slowly or losing more slowly, I think is the saying, is still losing. And it's not a rallying cry. So I think we should really be spending some time thinking about what we want, not what we think, the utility and review board will let us have, or, being small-minded about, gosh, I shouldn't ask for this. I shouldn't ask for a say in how my electricity is sourced and delivered, or what price I pay. I'm really inspired by what I'm learning about electricity cooperatives and municipally owned and operated utilities, several of which are right here in this province.
Thanks for offering that. I think this is a really good discussion. So I just wanted to give any of the other panelists a chance to jump in if they had any other thoughts on this before I move on.
Can I just say that I actually agree with what Tynette just said. The one distinction is that it's not necessarily that it's going to cost more. It's that to get on a lowest cost pathway over, say, the next 20, 30 years, you have to make upfront investments, and often those investments are made through electricity rates. And what we've seen in the last decade or so is some very short-term decisions where, you know, governments have decided that they wanted to keep the rates low. And, you know, they've done things like cap budgets for energy efficiency, which would have been lower cost. It would have been more cost effective. So that's, I think, the distinction, right? I mean, there is a very low cost pathway, especially with high carbon prices now, that is also green. But that means that we have to actually make some upfront investments. So how do we make those upfront investments in a way that people feel like it's fair?
Pausing to give anybody else another chance, and then we're moving on. Hard stop on this topic.
So let me throw in just a very quick anecdote. 20 years ago, I was visiting a cooperative electrical utility in Wisconsin that was getting all of its electricity from coal. But, you know, they had just finished building a platinum building that was very, very low energy use. And their plans 20 years ago were on how to get out of coal. And what we don't see here is that kind of thinking. We don't see it. We see it. We do see it, actually. We see it in Mahone Bay, Antigonish, and Berwick. We see they have windmills. They are working on solar gardens. Why is it that the three small municipal utilities are leading the way in terms of energy transformation? It's because they answer to people who can actually reach them. Whereas when you think about the province as a whole, if you call up your MLA and you talk to them about what, healthcare, you talk to them about roads, you talk to them, there are a dozen topics on their plate. When you talk to the councillors who deal with Mahone Bay Electric, they know what you're talking about, and they feel much more obligated to respond.
Thanks for that, everybody. I'm going to go back to Tina to offer some of that kind of advice for folks that want to continue engaging on this topic over the next several months, years, maybe longer. What are your thoughts on what folks can do to stay involved?
Sure. I mean, on that point, I don't think there's much more for me to say that hasn't already been said. And it's been a pleasure to hear so many of the ideas coming out from the other panelists. And one thing I would maybe just say, and say something that I think we can all recognize right now in sitting in and participating in this webinar, is that there are so many good ideas and so many routes to the changes that need to be made and to get us where we're going. And I think those conversations need to continue. I think that at some point, folks need to think about how best they're going to organize, because although I agree entirely, you know, reaching out to your representatives and also, you know, engaging with groups like the AC or the CR Club or others, all of that's really, really important. I do think that at some point, you know, having a shared vision come together in some way is going to be an important part of this process. And there may be a facilitative role for government to play in that. I mean, I'm thinking back to the natural resources strategy that the government developed with Nova Scotians over several years back in the early 2000s, where there, you know, was a clear need for Nova Scotians to come together and have some difficult conversations about the path forward. And so enormous public consultation was facilitated, and that gave people an opportunity to come together with government representatives listening in a way that could then feed back. Granted, honestly, not all of the outcomes that folks wanted to see came from that. And, you know, and a lot of folks in the end, I think, felt disappointed because they felt that they put a lot of time in and the government had good paths laid out for them and never took them. So that is always the reality. Or a realistic possibility, but I do think doing the work of coming together to develop some kind of path forward. I mean, it's difficult work, but I think it needs to happen in addition to all of the wonderful brainstorming that's been happening lately in conversations like this one and others.
I think those are all really good points. And we have several questions that have come in. I'm looking at the question document now. So I want to transition to the questions that came from our audience. I'll just pose the question and then anyone can jump in who has thoughts on the particular topic, and we'll just go from there. If you do have something you really want to say, you can always raise your hand and make sure that I get to you. So the first question I have from the audience is asking what you think about the concept of buying Emera back and making them a public utility again. Is that an option for the transition? Okay, Brendan, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's not the fundamental issue. And maybe I can try to explain that by walking through a couple scenarios. I mean, if you nationalize with the promise that people will never have to pay a higher price, you're not going to get a zero carbon transition. I think you're going to make things worse. You're going to get more political opportunism to keep rates low, which we saw, or cap rates in the short term, I should say, which led to the canceling of, say, for instance, the community feed-in tariff. If you nationalize and senior managers have the same incentives they do now, but with governments now more concerned about debt levels, you'll still have this disincentive to promote efficiency and renewables. So, even in different scenarios, like, do you want to be a Saskatchewan or a Hydro-Quebec, right? Like Saskatchewan has crown corporations. They're more locked into coal than Nova Scotia. They don't do any energy efficiency. Decision-making is not particularly transparent, and their electricity rates are about the same as Nova Scotia. If you want to be a Hydro-Quebec, I think the thing to really recognize is that utility was nationalized under a very strong understanding coming out of the Quiet Revolution project that it's not just about low rates. It's about societal goals like green technological development and energy independence. So I think nationalization could very easily put the entire energy transition in a dead end if it's the wrong kind of politics associated with it. So whether it's public or private or municipal utilities, which are very intriguing and have done great things, I think the issue is this definition of the societal goals and providing the right incentives to people who are managing those utilities.
Just pausing to give other panelists a chance to respond to what Brendan said.
I'll add to say, I think there's value in utilities not being privately held, particularly by big corporations. But rather than sort of thinking it either has to be sort of the Emeras of the world or the crown corporations like Nalcor in Newfoundland and Labrador or Quebec Hydro, that the kind of models that Tom was talking about actually exist. And I think communities at the local level have, I think if we have more say in our energy systems, we'll make better choices than the CEOs that are driven by shareholders, or better than the government appointed directors of a crown corporation. I'll put a link in the chat too that talks about how the city of Boulder they municipalized their utility, the private utility. It's a new word on me, but it is something that exists and has happened elsewhere as well.
Yeah, I would encourage all of the panelists, if you do have any kind of resources on things that you've mentioned, performance-based regulation or cooperative utilities or anything like that, to put those resources in the chat. I know folks would definitely be interested. I'm going to move on to the next question. Tina, if you're up for it, I would love for you to take a crack at this one, because I know you mentioned equity and how we weave that in one of your earlier responses. But we have a question that asks how we can acknowledge that we need to spend money on this transition, but also prevent low-income households from paying disproportionately for the transition. So how do we balance that?
Yeah, I mean, there are potentially a number of ways of going about that, and I'll just speak a little bit to changes that could be made within the existing system, because obviously the question becomes much broader and more complex for thinking about, potential new structures. So just to keep it simpler and a shorter answer. I mean, one thing that we've seen so far in Nova Scotia from work that has been done by advocates attempting to get, rate assistance programs for low-income ratepayers, for example, is that currently the way that the utility and review board's mandate is structured, its regulatory mandate, it has a role to make sure that there's no discrimination in the way that rates are charged. And given the history of the meaning of that word within the context of electricity regulation in particular, the utility and review board has interpreted that to mean that, discrimination really means basically everybody needs to pay the same for the same services. So it has basically said, we can't actually take steps to create rate assistance programs for low-income ratepayers, because we've got this mandate to ensure that there's no discrimination, that like services cost like rates, basically. There are, so something like that is a thing that could be changed. There are many public utilities. We've done some jurisdictional review. The Ecology Action Center and my organization have looked for other places where specifically, provisions for low-income ratepayers are built into the mandate as something that needs to be considered when rates are being set. So those kinds of things can be incorporated fairly easily into an existing structure like ours. And the point that I was making earlier about thinking realistically about the cost-benefit analysis that is currently happening. When Nova Scotia Power suggested this system access charge, they were effectively saying, well, what they did say was the value that solar power adds to Nova Scotia right now in 2021 is about 5.5 cents per kilowatt hour. There are problems with that analysis. We'll put them aside for now, but that was basically the value they stuck on. But when you look at what was being added up as the benefits that were contributing to that value, there weren't really the benefits like social cost of carbon, benefits of avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. So then when we're weighing out what are the costs to ratepayers and how do we distribute them equally, or sorry, not equally, equitably, when we are thinking about the costs of maintaining a reliable and safe grid, when we're doing that necessary exercise of figuring out how do we distribute these shared necessary costs, we can only do that in a fair way if we're thinking about, okay, what actually are the real costs and benefits that are being added? And then once we know what those are, how can we distribute the costs equitably? And right now, the UARB is just not equipped to do those analyses in the kinds of nuanced ways that they need to be done for us to meet our current moment. Its mandate is much too limited.
I'm going to let any other panelists comment on this one. I think it's an important question. And actually the next question is similar, but with net metering in specific. So like, how do we make sure that, that the few or the smaller percent of Nova Scotians who can afford the solar panels aren't paying disproportionately for the folks that can't. So I'll just leave this one open. Brenda, did you have your hand up? Yeah.
Yeah, just very quickly. I think there should be a right in the province to not find yourself in energy poverty, and that can be there's policies that can accomplish that, right? Automatic credits on bills that are unaffordable relative to income. The other aspect is energy efficiency. Nova Scotia spends more on low-income energy efficiency than most other jurisdictions. But if you look at someplace in the States, there's mandatory minimum spending for low-income efficiency. There's specific targets for energy efficiency dedicated to low-income families. And so all that's possible. But as Tina was mentioning, the UARB is actually from legal challenges that I was involved with when I worked at the EAC. Unfortunately, the UARB is constricted its mandate. So the government needs to tell the UARB that it has that role of thinking about low income impacts in particular.
Anyone else like to comment on this? Tom?
I like Brendan's point about what is going to drive the change. Do we know, if we don't know where we're going, any road will do. And so you need to know where you're going. You need to know clearly that you want to have efficiency, that you want to have an environmentally sound energy system. And I think that's crucially important that you do that. And part of the way to get that is to get the most responsive system that you can build. And the reality is that the more democratic and closer to the people the system is, the more responsive it will be. Now, if you were to say, let's have a co-op utility in every block, I would say, well, now I'm not quite so sure about that one. but I think that you need to get an energy system that people can actually touch. And we see that, in our municipal utilities. And if you had 1,000 people sitting on local utility boards, that would be 1,000 informed voices that we do not have now, in addition to our environmental groups. And that's the kind of thing that I think is just extremely valuable. And one final other point is, I think that, if we look, small scale tidal ought to be a no-brainer in this province with all the coastline that we have. There isn't any. Nobody's taking the lead on it. Nobody's doing a thing about it. We're looking at huge tidal things, but nobody's looking at the little ones that you could put in Mahone Bay Harbor or Lunenburg Harbor. And yet the tide's flowing there 22 hours a day.
It's like you're looking at my question sheet, Tom, because the next question I have here is someone expressing concern about how we're decommissioning lots of old generation energy plants, but we're not necessarily speeding up implementation of newer energy technologies. And they specifically mentioned tidal and what folks might think, why is there a hang up to rolling out tidal in Nova Scotia, given where we live? Who wants to take that first? I'll just pick on someone. Guru, any thoughts on tidal? You're in the middle of my screen, so it's not no reason other than that.
I have to be honest, I haven't thought about tidal in a very deep way, partly due to the reason that there haven't been many projects. There were pilots and they don't exist anymore mostly, or they're just beginning again. Well, every technology, I would say that for renewable energy as well, for wind and solar as well, we cannot follow the same path that we took for fossil fuel plants. Fossil fuel plants had, enormous environmental footprints. They were bad for the land, air, and water where they were established. The same path cannot be, applied to renewable energy. We can't do the same mistake again. So I would say, for me, tidal, if it is low impact and it does not affect the benthic populations or the seafloor species, then it's all right to be experimenting on and looking for a future in the province.
Yeah, totally fair to hopefully have learned some lessons and think more about the cumulative impacts of our choices as we explore other avenues. I have a question. I think I'll field it to Brendan first, but anyone else feel free to jump in here. But someone is mentioning it is possible that a response to the rate increase application will be to cap rates, as Brendan mentioned earlier. And they're noting that in 2012, there was a petition with 30,000 signatures against high power rates and opposing the efficiency fee. So how do we make sure the conversation stays focused on lower bills instead of lower rates?
Great question. Yeah, that's the point I'm, I guess, trying to make. I think there's two ways. One is, one is the very technical way is actually when we talk about that idea of performance-based regulation. There's one type of performance-based regulation which focuses on solely on rates and rate of return, which actually makes things worse in terms of giving the utility incentive to support things like customer solar energy efficiency. The other way of thinking about it is actually what's called a bill cap. You cap the entire bill for the province, and then you give the incentive to the utility to support bill reductions for people in the province through energy efficiency. I don't know, maybe more on the political or almost philosophical level, I think it's important to think about almost like the implicit sort of political bargain for affordability of thinking about rates versus bills, right? And what technologies it's associated with. So the focus on rates, it has a history, right? It has a history where the model is there are big utilities, they build giant nuclear power plants and hydro dams and coal plants, and they develop economies of scale, and they will deliver a lower price. And that's kind of the 20th century big technology, big polluting sort of social bargain. I think the social bargain with decentralized energy technologies, with clean energy technologies, is all about bills, right? It's all about saying, you can take greater control over your energy use. You can, through energy efficiency, you can actually participate as a community, as a municipality, even on site through renewable energy generation. People can start getting compensated for using energy at different times of the day, which has real value to the grid, right? So all that, that more citizen-based form of energy can't be focused on rates anymore, but we can deliver that affordability need by focusing on lower bills and on citizens actually generating some of their own energy. So that's the vision, I think, that Nova Scotia needs to find, through regulation and kind of a new type of politics.
There it is, the vision. Any other panelists want to comment on this or expand on it?
Yeah, it's more of a question, I would say. I should be in the audience asking all of these.
We'll allow it.
Yeah, I second the notion of decentralizing power, but I'm also looking to the cryptocurrency economy, for instance, just a lesson from there. When the currency was decentralized, the biggest obstacles came from centralized institutions. Banks and governments responded, posed the biggest obstacle. In this case, when we're talking about, municipally owned utilities and people producing their own power and serving themselves, I don't think it's that easy to, navigate when there is this big giant sitting there. And as an example, if you want to establish a community garden and a few people come together and establish this community garden, they have to pay a higher rate for the land to acquire the land in which they have to establish than Nova Scotia Power. In fact, in some of the cases, someone mentioned in one of the shared solar consultations done by the Department of Energy, that Nova Scotia Power got the land for free and established the solar garden. So how do we tackle that? It's the question that I keep pondering over.
I think, Mi'kmaq communities are also asking themselves, how is it that, the consortium West 4 is getting parcels of Crown land given to them to, log trees and so on. So I think the problem you're pointing to, Guru, is a fundamental issue of how our society functions, where corporations are going to get the tax breaks, the free parcels of public land or Mi'kmaq unceded territory. And so anybody who wants to, start a small solar business or a wind farm is going to find themselves, with unfair competition from the big guys. And, yesterday we just saw that we are now on the hook for $1.7 billion that Emera paid to build the Maritime Link, right? So it's almost like everything has to be supersized, like the Walmart or the Amazon model. And so we're going to be looking at more of these big monolithic projects, which are not environmentally friendly. I mean, mega hydro is not clean. We've got to stop using that language. It creates methyl mercury, poisons watersheds, it displaces Indigenous people from their land. And in the case of Muskrat Falls, it's like how many billions of dollars over budget now, and it's still not flowing. We're getting some of it here, but it's not flowing to the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. So I think part of it has to be just wrestling it from big corporations and saying we should have some say in our future. And we sort of forget that, or we're not, the elephant in the room here is that the stakes are so friggin' high, And it's almost like when I hear, net zero by 2050, I just kind of want to scream, because unless everybody was asleep last year when the IPCC, interpanel, help me out here, folks. Anyway, the UN
panel on climate change.
Thank you. Came out with its code red for humanity in August. And it basically said, okay, everybody, on your marks, here we go. You got to do it now, bring it down immediately by 2030, because everything that's already, all the greenhouse gas emissions that are already in the atmosphere are already going to have an impact on 2050. So if we're to have a fighting chance, then we got to take this seriously. And I don't know how many of you are parents, but when I think of this, I feel like it's as though somebody has a stranglehold on our kids. And we're standing here saying, well, maybe we could negotiate this or that. Meanwhile, we are jeopardizing everything. So I think we have to talk about that.
I totally agree. It is definitely existential in a lot of ways. And I think for me, at least personally, the small way I can kind of try to get through it is by trying to see these opportunities. And maybe this is one of those forks in the road, as has been mentioned, and we can try to make the most of it. And that's why we're here tonight. Okay, I'm just looking at my question sheet. I think we have time for a couple more. So I do have a couple of questions or folks asking if Brendan could expand on the answer before last. I think it's an important point. So they're asking, how could a provincially or municipally owned utility possibly be worse than the current situation with Emera and Nova Scotia Power? Isn't anything else better than a corporate monopoly, or am I missing something? And they note that they're just new to the topic, and I think tons of folks are. So it might be worth spending a minute just kind of explaining what you meant by that.
Yeah, I think it's instructive to go back to, some of the reasons why Nova Scotia Power was privatized in the first place. One of the reasons was because political leaders at the time didn't want to be responsible for the political cost of rates going up, right? And again, when we see when you if you nationalize something, you politicize it, right? And sometimes that can be very good or very bad. It depends on the politics. And a very important thread in Nova Scotia politics in particular has been political leaders not wanting to be responsible for rate increases in their term of government. And that has really stalled the low carbon transition. It led to some of the initial restrictions on net metering. It led to the cancellation of the community feed-in tariff. It led to the caps on the energy efficiency budget. So if you make a utility even closer to politicians, there's definitely one scenario where they continue to push off any investment in green energy or things that actually lower the total costs on consumers, like energy efficiency, or lower the total costs in the long term. I think I can see that easily happening unless you change the politics. So that's why I'm saying the public-private thing is not kind of the fundamental issue to me. It's about what do you want the utility to do in the politics. And again, I think there's lots of examples of crown corporations that have done very good things and have really empowered green transitions and technological innovations. But again, there's ones that have not done that. I mean, again, look at Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan's got crown corporations, and they don't have cheaper rates. They don't have, they're more locked into coal than Nova Scotia seems to be right now. So, I mean, it depends on the politics of the situation.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and keeping that distance between the politics and the utility can be helpful. And I loved the point that Tina made earlier too about building up that expertise at the regulatory level and really using that to help advance our shared goals. I know there's lots of regulatory commissions in the US who are doing great work and really have that kind of visionary leadership, and that's awesome to see. So it's definitely possible. Does anyone else have thoughts to add on this particular topic? I'll just pause. Tom?
Yeah, I think that the biggest driver was not efficiency, or it wasn't the rates in Nova Scotia. It was an ideological belief that you should privatize and get the provincial debt down. It was a reduction of provincial debt was the real driver. And I think, it's just, you're right, Brendan, the way the issues are discussed and the level of public discussion about them is probably the most crucial thing. And that's why a panel like this is really important. Do cooperatives always do the right thing? No, they don't always do the right thing, because some of them stop talking and thinking. But the problem with corporations, we just should never forget this. The purpose of Emera and Nova Scotia Power is not to provide us with electricity, nor is it to go to renewables, nor is it to do anything that will benefit the people of Nova Scotia. It is to benefit their shareholders. That's why their CEO is paid $8 million. He's paid $8 million because he is filling the shareholders' pockets. We can't do better using monopoly corporations whose purpose is to fill shareholders' pockets. Just doesn't make any sense.
I want to make a comment about the regulatory piece, because we have a board, the Utility and Review Board, and I hear sort of a lot of conversation around, we can make them do better. But I want to talk about the people who are on that board. So first of all, Jennifer Nicholson is on that board. She's one of only 2 women and there are 8 people in total, 6 men, 2 women. Jennifer is a former senior director of stakeholder relations for Emera. Okay. Everybody else is either a lawyer or an accountant, and I've got nothing against lawyers and accountants, but I don't feel reflected particularly by this 8-member UARB board. And I'd be curious, and people can put a thumbs up in the chat, if anybody has ever heard or spoken to Bill Mahody. So Bill Mahody is your residential, he represents Nova Scotia Power residential customers. Anybody know how to get a hold of him? Did he ask you what, is he going to call you to see what you think about the rate hike proposal? So this board that is supposed to, oversee the activities of Emera, in our province, Nova Scotia Power, these are like, people in some mystery realm that that do not reflect the multiplicity of Nova Scotians, and I don't think they have our backs.
Yeah, I definitely I feel that. I've looked at the names of the board as well, and I feel this pain. I tried to access the regulatory filing on the UARB website when it came out. Very hard to access. I think all of these spaces are really removed from us, and that's definitely a huge part of the problem. I'm going to go to one final question. We're pivoting it back to the topic of municipal utilities, and there are some questions wondering about if municipalities in Nova Scotia specifically have the legal avenue to even create municipally owned and run utilities, or is this even possible here in our province? Anyone want to field that?
Just say quickly, there is no government policy that would support that. There have been government policies to protect municipal utilities from being taken over at the time of the privatization, but there hasn't been anything to either encourage the development of utilities, and what it's hard to imagine under this current regulation, Nova Scotia Power allowing it.
Any other thoughts to offer on just those logistics?
Yeah, it's just the same as I mentioned for you want to establish something decentralized. How do you do it in the face of Nova Scotia Power stepping in and saying, you have to buy power from us? That's what happened in this case of this proposal on a systems access fee as well for solar customers. You are there, you took a loan or you got the money together and put a solar panel on your rooftop. Ultimately, you're still paying to the utility, and a proposal to pay even more, that doesn't make sense. So it should apply to a community as well.
Amazing. I think this has been such a great questions and awesome responses from all of our panelists. I think we're going to leave it there for the night. We have a cool 3 minutes left. Thank you once again for everybody for all of your insights and contributions, and to all the folks who joined and stayed on the line. I've been watching the participant number, and it's held true. So I think this is a moment for utility regulation. People are loving it. The EAC is going to post a link to the recording on their website, and there will also be a sign up link in the chat as far as I know. And they'll definitely keep you updated on their work on this and how you can take action. So thanks again, everybody, and have a really great evening. This has been awesome.